Welcome to the Theology and the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Oz Freeman. I'm the Assistant Professor and Program Director for Theology and the Arts here at United, and really excited to have with us one of our current students, Bryan Bliss, who's also a celebrated novelist. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Bryan, and turn this towards you so folks can see you.
Perfect.
Mask and all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. This is something that I come into very excitedly, but also with like great hesitation, only because I think it's one of those things where it's almost impossible to kind of, I think, collapse theology and art into an hour-long discussion, especially one by me. But it is one of those things where I think, my experience and my interest in this comes from the fact that it's very specific to like my story and how I kind of grew both as a writer and as a theologian, if you will, kind of simultaneously, that these two things have always fed each other and always worked together. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to it. One of the things that I always kind of start with in a talk like this is I try to not say what I'm going to say, and there's the idea that fiction like saved me, because it's like this admittedly like huge, grandiose kind of thing, and if somebody were to say it to me, I'd be immediately suspicious of them. I'd be like, sure. It's like, that sounds nice. But in my case, it's kind of the truth. I started out right out of college as a newspaper reporter, and I thought that was just going to be my career. I've always written. One of the kind of funny stories that I tell my kids is that when I was in middle school, very unpopular, walking through the hallways and seeing this huge sign that said, "Join the newspaper." And I was like, oh, that's what's going to make me popular. It did not work out. But it did kind of start off that kind of love of writing, of being able to say, oh, when I write something down, there is an effect, or there is a reaction, good or bad. And that continues today. But it led me into being a newspaper reporter. And so I was working as a newspaper reporter for a large paper in North Carolina. And right about the time, there was a death penalty case that was finishing up its appeals process. And it went really quickly for a number of different reasons. And at that time, North Carolina was in the habit of scheduling executions like immediately. The idea was, well, that's a whole nother class probably. But the idea was that they didn't want people to have to wait, ironically. And so I was a newspaper reporter. I was on the crime and courts beat. And so my editor came to me and said, hey, every hometown newspaper has a witness. And so you have to go. And I was like, so up until this point, I'd always been kind of like philosophically against the death penalty. And I didn't know how to like articulate that, I guess, to them. And basically the line that was given to me is like, you're going to win a newspaper award for this. And if you don't do it, you might not have a job. And so I always say this is kind of like the least amount of courage I ever had in my life is kind of accepting this assignment and going into that room. And so basically I went into North Carolina Central Prison in Raleigh, and I was a witness to an execution. So that's something that happened in 2001. And I spent the next, that's the reason I went to seminary. It's, trying to kind of like unwork this thing, this kind of like a huge moment of like indignity and dehumanization that I kind of saw. And I tried to write about it for years and years and years, because writing has always been this thing that made me kind of process the world in the way that I think about things. But ultimately I realized that I couldn't be a journalist, because I came out of that room fundamentally changed, one, but also knowing that I was super pissed off and that I wouldn't be able to actually be objective in the way that supposedly, back then at least, journalism kind of was. And so I wanted to be able to do writing that would help me first, and then other people be able to kind of process the kind of, can I swear?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I forgot where I was for a second. The kind of the shit and the trauma that we go through. And so that was kind of the story. And it took me 15 years to write it. And it came out in this book, which is called We'll Fly Away. And I'm just going to read a little part of it, because I think it's one of those things of part of where I start with the talking about theology and arts is that it is a very kind of embodied and lived thing, that like my experience is gonna be different than Jill's or Meg's or whoever's it is. And that's kind of where the conversation starts for me. And the way this book is set up is it's written in third person, and then it also has letters that the main character is writing to his best friend, Toby, from death row. So, let's see how this takes. Today I woke up with Sister sitting there staring at me. I was about to crack a joke, Sister being a nun, about her being a closeted creeper when I saw her face, like she'd been told that the world was about to end. It's this never-ending space that feels like the floor has disappeared and all you can do is fall and fall and fall. I shot to my feet already, knowing that what she was going to say. They took Eddie back this morning, so Eddie was another character on death row. Now I know there wasn't anybody looking. I know there weren't any dudes out there trying to catch me in this moment, but still, when she said that, man, I just nodded, even though everything inside of me started flying, T. I wanted to punch the damn wall, to scream and to cry and to fall apart, because goddamn, even though I knew it was coming, even though I knew it wasn't coming, it's coming for every dude in this place, it hurt me in a way that I didn't think was possible anymore, in a way that I didn't even remember was there. That's when I saw it. Sister was trying just as hard to keep herself right side out. When she stood up, I didn't know what to do. It was almost time for breakfast, but how was I supposed to sit there and eat when Eddie was back there all alone, isolated like some kind of rabid animal? And make no mistake, T, that's why they do it. That's why they put you in a room all alone, away from everybody except your lawyer, and if you're lucky, any family that still claims you. Put you in a room right next to the one where they'll strap you to that gurney, stick those needles in your arm, and let you die in front of a room full of strangers. They do it because your life doesn't mean shit to them, no matter what they say. That's how they let you die, like some kind of dog kicked to the side of the damn road. And I'll just stop there. But that was one of the first passages that I wrote from that book. I wrote it probably 8 years before I actually knew what the book was, because just trying to process that type of emotion. So again, for me, that's where a lot of this starts. A lot of the start for theology is like, how am I trying to figure this stuff out from an ethical place, from a theological place, and sometimes just from a pure like place of trying to process my own trauma. And that's where a lot of times those things come out. So I kind of joked about fiction saving me. And one of the kind of things in the art and faith community that I come from, they a lot of times will say beauty saves the world. And I always put a comma after that and said, but can fiction save people? Now I'm even more suspicious of this line when it's used for other people. Like I can use it for myself and I feel like, okay, it's like cringy and I maybe can't sleep as well when I say it that night. But it's like, you know, if you're using it for other people, like if I'm saying that my work will save you, there's something gross about that to me a little bit. And especially for teenagers, which is primarily who I still write for. I think it's a little bit hard to say that because it doesn't sometimes acknowledge the tragedy and the chaos that a lot of teenagers are kind of going through in their everyday lives. And so instead, I came up with this thing, and I wrote it this morning, and I was really happy with it, so I'm going to share it with you. I think it's better to say that fiction has the opportunity to transform us, to introduce us to new possibilities, and to see reality as something that is changeable. It's like, oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just say that.
Yeah.
We're out. Give everybody your time. And so for this part of the talk, I'm gonna focus a little bit on young adults, because I think young adult fiction, for better or worse, believes that they're doing a greater good a lot of times when it comes to writing. And now whether you buy into that or not is something that is a different sort of talk and not the sort of thing I'm going to say or talk about when it's being recorded, because I want to get canceled by the YA community. But there isn't a sense that we're doing a greater good as a part of the writing, that it's not just out there for art's sake, that there is something out there about, that we have a responsibility that what we put into the world actually has some kind of value in the lives of the people who are going to be picking up and reading it. Yeah, but and so like I said, whether you buy into that or not is a whole different story. But I think what they're trying to get at, or the thing that I like about it, is that they're acknowledging that there's a certain amount of openness to a teenager as opposed to an adult. And so that kind of adolescence like ability to kind of maybe shift thoughts and be able to say, oh, well, this is something that really inspires me. That happens more in that time period than it does as when we do with an adults. And a lot of that comes from like this developmental change. Like there's a loss of novelty, like literally like brain chemistry, there's a loss of novelty. I like to call it whimsy because for a couple of different reasons, but there's that loss of like whimsy or novelty that happens with teenagers. And suddenly they think everything is boring. So I don't know if you've ever seen, experienced, or partaken in it yourself, that specific sort of teen, like ennui. But it's like, but that's what this is happening, right? Like a lot of times is that like all of a sudden, when there's no meaning in anything anymore. And so for me, writing fiction for teenagers allows you to give them a chance to be able to find that meaning. Now, I'm going off script here, but preacher's gonna preach, I guess. But for me, like this becomes the difference between like religious books and books by people of faith. And so like a religious book is one where it's going to try to tell you what that meaning is. And I'm guilty of that a little bit sometimes. But for me, where I think it really works for teenagers is where it says, I'm a person of faith. I'm a person that has a very deep kind of respect and interest in theology. And that stuff is going to come out in my books. And to me, that's much more important. It gives the teenager or whoever's reading this open opportunity to say, hey, I'm experiencing this thing. I don't exactly know what it is, but maybe I can test it out for a little bit. Let me go back to my script here. Yeah, so again, I'm not going to necessarily litigate whether like fiction can actually save people, and especially teenagers. Because like I think when we say that online, especially, it happens in such broad sweeps. It actually sweeps away a lot of the specifics that are happening with teenagers and stuff. That's it's like, well, teenagers, like my daughter who has struggled with things in the past, and I would never say to her, read this book, this is what's going to save you. It's like, no, what's going to save you is going to a mental health, but I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, which what they're saying is that the openness of a YA book is going to allow teenagers to kind of open something, test things out, and be able to figure out where they're going from there. And one of the things that I love about that with books is like, it's this idea for people to be able, especially teens, to safely try out and privately challenge assumptions. And I think there's nothing more important than, especially teenagers who grew up in religious households, to have that opportunity in books. I did not necessarily grow up evangelical or in any way. I could kind of read whatever I wanted. One thing that's always on my mind is like, how can I present things in my books that are going to be a healthy way of looking at it? Or so obviously dysfunctional that there's no way you can read it any other way. And so in Will Fly Away, there's 2 different like sex scenes, and I get killed for it all the time, just killed. And one of them is like this very nice and like nurturing and loving like sex scene that happens in a house, and it's like they're like laughing and they're just very tender toward each other. And the other one happens in the back pickup of an El Camino. It's like, so like there's a difference there, right, between those 2 things. And so that might be something where they can read this book and kind of try that on a little bit. In No Parking at the End Times, it's a little bit more obvious. This is a book about a cult, essentially, end of the world kind of cult. And my kind of whole idea for this book in writing it was, I want to show a kid who might not be in that situation, but might be in something kind of close to that situation, that there are other ways that you don't have to toss away all of this stuff. You don't have to toss away your faith to be able to kind of connect with something that's not this kind of patriarchal, doomsday stuff that's happening in a lot of churches. And like I said, so when it comes to theology, I think it's critically important, because suddenly you can just show them that there's a different way, that there's more than one truth or one way of kind of talking about this stuff out there in the world. And again, it's one of those things too, that kids and teenagers are remarkably resilient. They could read this book and be like, oh yeah, that was a book about a kid who lived in a van, and never catch any of the stuff. Or read this one and it's like, yeah, that's a book about a wrestler. It's like, wait, what? Which I had an email this, I love wrestling. Are you gonna write any more wrestling books? It's like, dude, the book had wrestling in it. So there is something that's really interesting about it, that teenagers can, unlike a movie or a TV show or even like a podcast, they can read something and they can go right past something that they're not ready to comprehend. But also I think it does build something inside of them that maybe allows them to be able to pick that book up later and find it again. So yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna give an example of that from No Parking at the End Times. Should I read? No, I'm not gonna read my favorite paragraph. I'll just read one. Read the favorite paragraph? It's not relevant to the talk, but I'll read it. It's literally the first thing I wrote. What's that? Well, I was joking beforehand. I was joking with some people that of my 4 books, I have like 4 paragraphs that I actually like, and I was just going to read those paragraphs. And the kind of the sad part is like all of them are usually the first paragraph that I actually wrote for the book, including this one. So. But this is a girl who is with her family, and they're fully expecting to be raptured up into in theory. And what I wanted to kind of show in this is the idea that there's fear in this, and that you don't, that maybe you should be scared when something like this happens, kind of honoring the fact that some of the stuff that we talk about is just crazy.
Yeah.
So, all right, this is it. My knees are numb, beginning to bruise. Next to me, my brother Aaron holds my hand. He's barely even here anymore. Mom clings to both of us like we're still little kids and in a crowd. The only thing I hear are Dad's prayers whispered to the ceiling like a secret. I try to focus on how it will happen. Will the room tilt? Will everything fast forward in a flash of light, sending us up, up, up? 10 minutes, 5, right now. It could happen anytime, in the blink of an eye. The trumpets will sound, and then we'll all be done with the troubles of this world, troubles we crossed an entire country to leave behind. We're waiting, almost 30 people, kneeling on the tile floor of what used to be a convenience store. Every one of us has come from far away, swayed in some way by Brother John's promises. I'm supposed to be happy because we are bound for a better place, for the promised land, our true home. I squeeze Mom's hand and then Aaron's. If I could, I'd reach for Dad too. I squeeze until I think I'm going to break their bones, adding my own prayer, the only one I know anymore, to the hum of the room. I'm not scared, I'm not scared, I'm not scared. I hold on, I pray, and I wait. And so, the best one in the book. No, and like for me, what that does is like, that sets up the thing of like, this is important. And so it's like so much young adult stuff, I think, especially when it deals with religion and regular fiction, adult fiction as well, immediately assumes that this has no value for teenagers. And so what I want to do is say, no, this does have value for teenagers. It's just like, we don't do a good job of showing them why it has value, or we try to force it on them in one way. So the idea behind that whole paragraph and what the rest of the book is this thing of how can we make something, how can we honor the fact that a teenager does have a very vibrant and specific spiritual life, which the church is, and at least in the Christian tradition, does a really, really terrible job of, but different talk. But also being able to show that, but not all those paths are equally valid and we should accept them. Like if you find yourself praying on the floor of an ex-convenience store with your family and you sold everything you had and drove across the country, maybe you should question that. So in that mode, the question then becomes, what does fiction do? Like if you're going to read fiction like theologically, what does it do? Like how do you use it? How can you read it? I like to start with the fact that fiction is an opportunity to challenge the sense that life is meaningless, especially in this world of adolescence. So this idea that we can kind of, especially now, we can get into this thing of like, well, the world is all just going to hell. Everything, police violence, and murders, and the climate crisis, and COVID, and everything is just falling apart. And fiction, even fiction like mine, which does not necessarily paint a bright picture of the world sometimes, there's an opportunity to be able to see the world differently and to find those kind of glimmers of hope and to be able to see that this stuff is not meaningless. Because it's not meaningless simply for the fact that I can connect with, well, bad example, because these are all, we'll say Jill, because I know Jill. Jill might not have any connection to this book necessarily, but can connect with it on a deeper level, kind of humanity, of the fact that, oh, I've had relationships like that, or I've struggled in this way because of that. And so fiction gives us that chance to be like, that the connection and sometimes the fight against meaningless is in those kind of connections, even if they're packaged in stories that are highly, highly depressing, but available everywhere. Just kidding. Because it allows us to kind of experience joy and grief and even hope, like in the midst of all those things. And it shows us that these things are both what I like to say temporary and then beyond circumstance. And I was joking beforehand, I was like, I'll say in a second, like there's a part in one of my books where I say that joy is beyond circumstance. And I was like, did I come up with that? I did not come up with that. There's no way. Like it's pretty damn good. So maybe I'll just claim that I came up with it because I put it in the book. And I was reading Paul Tillich for a class, and it was like, oh, Paul Tillich came up. All right, fine. Me and Paul Tillich. Okay. So anyway, what do I mean about that? About being beyond circumstance? Is that good fiction, what I would call good fiction, in my opinion, it does not present like our spiritual or emotional or physical lives as a monolithic kind of thing. It shows us that sometimes grief, is something that we can work through. It shows us that connections to people, like I just mentioned, that we might never know. People are healing and like healing or being healed like the way we are in multiple different ways. We can see that happening in different ways that we might be expected. I'm going to read something from that in a second. That it normalizes what it means to be hurt, right? That we all felt hurt and been hurt and are hurt, but also what it normalized that healing looks completely differently, that there's not one way to heal. And that this happens differently, like I said, for every single person. There is nothing more, despite this book coming out in the middle of a pandemic, and that was the thrust of this book, which is called Thoughts and Prayers, was the idea that, that when something happens, so the basics of this book is there's a school shooting, and then the book picks up a year later, because if Bryan Bliss is nothing, it's not commercial. And because if you wanted to write a successful book, it would be to write a book in the moment of a school shooting. But that is kind of gross to me. And so this is a book instead that happens a year after the school shooting, which is, marketing people love me. But the idea is like that the kind of like tendrils or the fingers of grief, those things don't go away when the trucks leave, right? Like when the next shooting happens or when the next trauma happens. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to show is that we are all heal differently, and we heal in different ways, and that takes the work of therapists. It takes the work in this book of a kid playing Dungeons and Dragons, lots of different things. And so I'm going to read a section from this about one of the ways that one of these kids is healing. And the reviewers did not like the Dungeons and Dragons part, which, whatever. It was too made up, and I was like, what? Dungeons and Dragons in a novel. Whatever. Sign your reviews. Like, you sign your reviews, and then I'll care what you have to say. Yeah. All right, let's see where I'm at. So her therapist, her name is Eleanor. Her therapist always starts with questions like, "How's your world today, Eleanor?" And so she after her therapist doing a therapist trick and just sitting there waiting for her to talk, she finally says this: "Well, my world is pretty shitty today," I finally tell her. It makes her laugh, and she nods, her eyes closed, as if I've just saw some kind of Zen koan. Shitty how? And so I tell her everything about Trevor and Right Wing Report. So like she basically, when the school shooting happened, she made t-shirts that said "fuck guns," and she became like the poster child. And now in her small southern town, people just can't get over it. So they still think this is who she is, even though she's trying to. That was like a response, and they saw it as something else. And so pretty soon I can feel the anger coming alive, which is the whole reason I stopped by to see her. Because at what point does it end? At what point am I not going to be angry? Well, anger is a symptom, Eleanor. You know that. Everybody helps in a different way or heals in a different way. Some of us avoid danger, some of us cry, some of us just disconnect. And some of us scream. She considers her tea, takes a sip, and then looks at me. Trauma is often more of a spectrum than a fixed position. Sometimes we might feel normal, but that doesn't mean our trauma ever really goes away. If we're triggered, then it's natural we might go back to the things that seem to heal us, Well, I spend most of my time telling myself everything is okay, I say, that I shouldn't be angry. It's been months of that, a year of pretending. And sometimes I catch myself thinking it's real, that I'm not really, really angry. Or maybe you're not pretending. I sit back in my chair and work the handle of the coffee cup between my thumb and forefinger. Of course, Holston, my therapist, lets me sit there like that, wordless and clueless, because I have no idea if I'm actually pretending, or if this sudden flare-up of anger is normal, or if everybody lives with a bubbling layer of hot love under every single interaction. It hasn't gone away, I say. All the anger is still there, just like it has been all year. Healing isn't a straight path, Eleanor. It twists and it turns, it curves back in a way that sometimes we see where we've been, but the path is still moving forward. Unless it's just a big circle, I say. Dr. Holston sits back and considers this, which is something I truly appreciate about her. As if I sometimes introduced a concept that was not only new to her, but something that might affect her life in a positive way. She sips her tea, plays with her jade earrings she always wears. I'll skip that part. Even if anger were a circle, Holston says, that doesn't mean that we aren't moving forward. In fact, it might actually prepare us for the ups and downs, the twists and turns of our life. If it's a circle, we've been there before. What do you think? Well, I think I'd rather be on a flat drag strip with no turns and a clear direction. Dr. Holston laughs and says, well, wouldn't we all, dear? Wouldn't we all? For me, like, the main thing of this book was showing, like, the three different kids who were, they were not involved in the shooting, they didn't know the shooter, they weren't hurt in the shooting, but the fact that, like, this is something that affects you. This is something that affects my kids. My kids are scared to death to go to school. They're in high school still, and they're scared to death to go to school because something might happen. And so, like, trying to acknowledge the fact in a novel, which, like, again, hopefully this is something that never happens to any of the kids who read this, but to be able to say, like, oh, I know what that fear is, or I know what that grief is, even if it's something totally disconnected, is a way of using, for me, theology in books. So yeah, so at some point it can teach us that certain qualities of life, whether they're theological or not, are beyond our current circumstances. That they can be tapped into and found in the unlikeliest moments of spaces. One of the things I love doing, people call it gallows humor all the time, but I love like having like moments of levity in the middle of a book where like two kids are like trying to escape their parents who are doing this thing, and one kid's like starts cracking on the other kid because he wore like a certain kind of shirt or whatever, right? Like I love introducing those things because it shows that we don't have to live, that none of us actually live in, like I said, those monoliths of feelings, that sometimes we are there, but there are always moments and there's always people who are able to kind of pull us out of that a little bit, or show us a little bit of a glimmer of that joy or that hope that kind of lives beyond the circumstances that we're kind of currently in. Like I said, in the book Will Fly Away, I wrote Joy is Beyond Circumstance. Thank you, Paul Tillich. And this is written by a young man who is sitting, like I said, on death row. So suddenly we can see joy not as this thing that is like simply material, this thing that has to happen that we have to like find, but instead it's something that is connected to the divine, I would say. So it's something that's always out there, something that even in the worst of our situations gives us the potential to still remain being human, to still be seen as human, which I think when you talk about death row is like very important. Because it allows especially for teenagers, it allows for compassion to become a part of what the reading experience is. And my hope would be also like their main purview for theology. So like you're able to suddenly see people not as like scary mugshots or people that are statistics, but instead actual human beings. One of the great things about this book is I got to Sister Helen Prejean wrote me a blurb, and she let me use a quote from the beginning as the I messed this up, epigraph, right? Yeah, epigraph, not epitaph. It's one of those. Epigraph. She says this: "It's easy to forgive the innocent. It's the guilty who test our morality. People are more than the worst things that they've ever done." And so when we can kind of think about fiction as a way to kind of enter into the mindset of a person, because the way this book is set up is you know that Luke, main character, is guilty on page 1. I tell you, he did it. And so the struggle with the book becomes, how do we, I love this kid by the end. There's certain parts I can't read in this book because it'll make me cry, because I really care about what, and that's what I want from the kids that read it too, to be able to be like, oh, now the people who are in jail, the people who are migrant workers, the people who are serving me at a restaurant, whatever it is, I can no longer not see them as an actual person. I can't be blind to that anymore, because now I know this kid who might be made up, but this kid who I'm really pissed off because he shouldn't be there. He shouldn't be there. And so it creates all of this thing of being able to kind of create compassion, which creates, hopefully a yearning for justice. And I think that then for like, when you talk about art, it creates this kind of essential material kind of reality that I think all good art should have. It's a way of being able to say that the world is not fixed. So like a teenager needs to hear that, in my opinion. And I think we all need to hear sometimes that too, right? That the powers and principalities are not fixed. They can be changed and transformed or maybe even toppled if they need to be. Now the last part of this talk is I just wrote down a bunch of quotes. So we're gonna see if I can stitch them together on the fly. So if I do a good job at it, know that this was a work. And if I don't know, they're just all sitting here. But Simone Weil wrote an essay called The Responsibility of Writers, and it's a challenge and a mandate that I think most writers will, if not refuse, will at least let themselves off the hook pretty easily. And this is what she writes: "Literature of the 20th century consists in describing states of the soul by displaying them all on the same plane without any discrimination of value, as though good and evil were external to them, as though the effort towards the good could be absent at any moment from the thought of the person. Writers do not have to be professors of morals, but they do have to express the human condition. And nothing concerns human life so essentially for every person at every moment as good and evil. When the literature becomes deliberately indifferent to the opposition of good and evil, it betrays its function and forfeits all claims to excellence." And one of the reasons why I picked that quote is there's lots of fiction out there that is disposable, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wish I could write that. That is where the money is. It is not in these books, I can tell you that. To be able to write something like that is fine. There's a true talent to being able to write stuff that is actually, I want to say enjoyable, but hopefully entertainment, right?
Yeah.
But when you're talking about, and you could make and argue that theology and art should be entertaining as well. But I think that there's an extra burden when you start talking about theology and art, and especially theology and fiction. There's an extra burden to expressing that human condition, and that leads you down paths that maybe John Green kind of does it. I don't want to say anything bad about anybody, but like it's going to lead you down a path different than other novels, and that's something that I have kind of grasped onto, for better or worse. And the perfect example of this, and I told my editor I was going to write a book, a funny, happy book about a rom-com relationship between these two people. And now it's a book about a dead dad and the ghost of Karl Marx and class war. So we are who we are, I guess. The next quote is from a book called White Flights, Race, Fiction, and the American Imagination by Jess Rowe. Amazing, amazing book. Not that any of us have extra time to be reading extra books, but one that I really would recommend. And he writes, very little contemporary American art or writing of any kind produces public discussion, let alone reaction from state authorities or people in positions of power. And that immediately made me think of Walter Brueggemann, who writes, imagination must come before implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and imagine almost nothing. The same royal consciousness that makes it possible to implement anything and everything is the one that shrinks imagination because imagination is a danger. Thus, every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing futures alternatives to the single one the king wants to urge us as the only thinkable one. There is nothing more important in fiction than that right there, and especially fiction that has any kind of theological bent or interest, even the most minimal of that. That is it right there for me. This idea of like, if a kid can pick this up and have no opinion of the death penalty, and I tried really hard not to make this a polemic, or has no, thinks that maybe, well, I want to go hunting, well, what's wrong with guns? To pick up a book and just have even a moment of being like, okay, well, I see how this injustice happens. And to have that, just that pause, like that to me is that ability to be able to think about fiction and to think about the world, again, as a changeable kind of place, a place that is not static and not meant to be, that there's nothing that we can do, which fights again against that kind of hopelessness and meaningless. I have one more quote, but I'm gonna skip it because I'm like, I talked way longer than I thought I was going to, which is good. I thought I was gonna have like 10 minutes and be like, questions? Would you like me to read my third favorite paragraph? But no, yeah, I'll skip the last quote because it doesn't necessarily thing and kind of turn over to questions and answers. So. I have 3 books, and anybody who's online and local, if you would like one of these books, and there's some left, I'll leave them, and you can pick it up. So
we have plenty of time for questions. Folks on Zoom want to unmute and shout something out or put something in the chat. We can do it that way too, or anybody. Yeah.
Bryan,
yes.
I'm like hurting myself medically from how much I agree with you. Like something's breaking.
Yeah,
no.
good.
A couple thoughts that came through. This is territory I'm familiar with. There's a chapter in my master's thesis that's about literature and theology, but a whole bunch of connections snapped off for me during this talk. For one thing, this reminds me of Dr. Green's idea about reality as constructed and about art. He likes to talk about comedians in particular, exposing the gap between reality and, what does he say? Between reality, well, exposing the absurdity of reality, the gap between what we say we are and what we actually are, and think is another. And yeah, great art exposes so much about reality as constructed, as these are things, reality is all these things put together, and they can be put together in different ways. And that makes me think of how I 8 novels, I devoured them in my teens and 20s as fiction saving my life. Like what you say, I needed so bad to take in the fact that there were other ways of living and examples of that what I had grown up with was not the one way a person could make a life. And I still love that about fiction, but there was a time where it just like consumed them for that. But that's also, but I also love fiction for entertainment purposes, and even I think great literary fiction is entertaining for many of us. And this reminds me of Tillich's depth dimension. I'm so sorry. I'll stop in 1 second. I'll stop in a second here. It also reminds me of Tillich's depth dimension of reality, the way great art forms a symbol that opens up something sacred about reality and reveals depth dimension.
Yeah, and it allows, I mean,
Depth dimensions of depth.
Depth.
Okay.
yeah.
I say.
Not
I
depth.
said depth.
Yes. Well, sure.
Open up the gates of hell.
That's right.
Okay,
Well, the
sorry,
two things
sorry.
about that, like, yeah, like the whole, I tried really hard not to quote extensively Paul because I'm reading him right now. Yeah, the idea of like a challenge, lets people, like especially kids, be able to challenge symbols too. And when a symbol has died, you know, there's, and that's what I think we're going through a lot of now with like the idea of like COVID and stuff, like a symbol of like security somehow has died. And so like when that's a huge shift for kids, and fiction's a way that I think that they can kind of navigate that. And it'll be really interesting to see when we get past the kind of immediate like prom was canceled. How will 2 kids go to? So this is a book that would be crazy popular, right? But how will 2 kids in a bubble go to prom, right? Or something like that. When we get past that, and we get like 5 years down the road, and you start seeing the fiction that's not really about the pandemic, but actually is about the pandemic.
Yeah.
That's when you're going to start seeing that stuff.
Yeah.
And then as far as Dr. Green, something he said in class, which I have email, is kind of what kicked off this idea of when you asked me, is like, why don't we talk about this? And it's basically the idea of reading Alice Walker theologically, but in a way that calls us to adapt our theological thinking to her, rather than trying to adopt her as a theologian, which I think is a really, and I totally did not even go after that in this, because I got like 5 paragraphs and I was like, yeah, I'm not up for that today. But like the idea of like, that's a way of reading theology. Like, what if theology comes at you, not as to be a theologian, but as just a separate type of thing. You see that in womenist theology and everything else. So. Yeah.
Reality is fickle.
Reality is fickle.
It is
Yeah.
fickle. You made this comment about teenagers and that they lose their sense of whimsy and go through that ennui period. I also devoured books,
Same.
and I think that fiction saves people because it stops that process. And readers who were readers as kids, especially through their teens, have in their 20s and 30s and 40s and older, a different sense of the possible and of whimsy,
Yeah.
and they don't lose that. And they may posture it as teens, but they don't actually go there in the same way. So I do think that there's something about fiction, and I'd love to see the neurochemistry on it, right? That prevents that loss of the magical.
Yeah. And to be clear, I was kind of operating in a little bit of like hyperbole with that, because I think how used is exactly how I feel about it. My fear is always if we take too grand of a notion, especially as young adult writers, to say that this is the only thing kids need. It's like, that sets up a dangerous precedent of like, a book will do exactly that, but a book is no match for therapy if a kid needs therapy, or pharmaceuticals if that's what they need and stuff like that. So that's why I always get a little bit, because it always gets trotted out there as this kind of like grand proclamation on Twitter, which maybe I should just get off Twitter. That could be the problem. But
It's also the same logic behind the book banners. This book
Yeah.
will hurt children.
Yeah.
It's
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Based on the exact same logic of the thing.
Interesting. So yeah.
I think what you said about transformation, but then especially about representation in fiction being key to that whole, maybe not saving, because I also kind of have that idea of like, no, I never want to say my art has any power to save anybody kind of thing.
Yeah.
But just the transformation or pulling someone through it, more or less, in that representation being so important. Or someone else putting words to the same feelings like a teen would have in that character that they haven't articulated themselves.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a question. My comment is simply, this is wonderful. that someone is finally writing this kind of fiction.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's one thing young adult fiction does really well, is representation. I mean, they are, you can't get away with stuff, and you shouldn't be able to, and that you can get away with in adult fiction. And that goes back to that idea of like, we want this to represent the kids. Like, it is funny that my daughter, who is a radical lesbian teenager, often will say, like, these books are dumb. It's like, there's nobody that acts like that. And then so I have to explain to her, it's like, well, but you might, not everybody gets to grow up in the generous and wonderful household that you do, which then she immediately turns it off. But it's like, you know, sometimes you have to kind of go over that step of representation to kind of, that's kind of like a hyper reality sometimes, because people have to be able to see themselves in a joyful situation where maybe they weren't represented in a book before. And that's something that, you know, there's a trick to that about doing it in a way that isn't like tokenism, but also isn't like kind of whitewashing every character to make them all the same. And I think that's one of the things I'm appreciative about YA, is that it, not that it forces you, but you're held accountable to if you don't make those choices. And some people choose not to do it, but I think we're better off when, you know, when we can, again, representing the reality that a teenager's actually in. And I tend to be much more like muted, despite all contrary evidence, but I'm like muted in kind of my in the way that I write and the way I kind of represent things like that. But yeah, YA does that really well. So.
Well, else? Anybody? Any Zoomers? Any comments or questions?
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I've enjoyed the whole thing. And one of the things I've often thought of that saving question too, and wouldn't use that word. But what I do think, one of the things I'm preparing hopefully to do here is be a hospice chaplain, which is not something you're going to save anyone through, right? Like, but there's that accompanying someone that doesn't feel all that important until you're in a desperate situation. And then being accompanied can be incredibly important. And so that's just what popped into my mind when I thought about the books when I had really tough times as a teenager and things, that the fact that there was a book that made me feel like I belonged to something or could, and that there might be something on the other side. The book itself may not have saved me, but it certainly held my hand until I got to that next place. And that, I think, that's just what, I don't know if that resonates with anyone else, but that's what just jumped into my mind when you were talking about it. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's like core to, in my other life, I'm like a unrepentant youth pastor. So I was bringing that energy to the room. But that's the same thing with doing any kind of ministry with teenagers. It's that same thing. I love the idea of like accompanying as a part of fiction, though. I'm totally I'm gonna write your name down and then steal that and give you credit on my next talk. And I think that's wonderful.
I'm sure I stole it from somewhere, so.
Probably Paul Tillich, yeah.
Right. I was wondering if you could narrate a little bit because you mentioned you were at Vanderbilt when you started writing first book, right? And so both to narrate like the process of that, of like writing a first book, and as you're in graduate school, like that's a whole thing.
Yeah. Don't do it.
So is that process like, and then also why young adults? Like why that, is it tied to the youth pastor thing, or is it like, you know, why that audience?
Yeah, I mean, it started, now it's kind of silly to think about it that way, but it started because I was getting ready to have my daughter Nora. She was getting ready to be born like a month later, and I had this freak out moment of like, I'm never gonna write a novel if I don't do it now. I'm already 27.
That's adorable.
I know. Right? I felt old in seminary though. Yeah, right. Especially starting to get published for however many years until that. And so that was part of it. It was kind of like deep urgency to put something down on paper or in a computer at that time. And that's what kind of started it. And then once I got off, part of it was just kind of, there's a lot of getting past the kind of like voice of judgment. You know, like Anne Lamott talks about that, I think, the K-fucked radio and all that stuff. If you haven't read Bird by Bird, it's wonderful. But getting through all of that and like being able to push through those things and being like, okay, I actually have something that I think I can say, because I always tell people like writing is inherently an arrogant activity because you think that you have something to say that other people need to hear. And you have to just embrace that. for some of us it's not as hard as for others maybe. But I think that was part of it. It was like there was an urgency to do it. And I knew that I was going to be coming out of school and having a job and going to have a kid and moving to a new state. And I just felt like, okay, I got to do this now. And when I finished it, it was kind of the snowball effect of like, well, shit, I just finished this book. What do I do next? I guess I'll just keep working on it. And I worked on it for 6 years. It was so bad, like so bad. It's the book that actually ended up getting me my agent, but it was just not a good novel. But it taught me how to work, like how to write and how to revise. And so I thought it was the only idea I was ever going to have. And it was a terrible idea. It was about a waiter who worked at the Olive Garden who gets what do you call it, recruited by the CIA while he's also trying to make amends with his ex-girlfriend. Bad novel idea. Like, don't write that. Excuse me. And so, but I worked on it, and it was the way I basically taught myself how to write. What I realized out of that though is that like ultimately this book did not have what these books have, which is me actually trying to say something. That was essentially me 6 years of going to graduate school and learning how to write by myself.
Okay.
Just like sitting there and writing by myself. And then I went and got an MFA later because I'm not glutton for punishment. But I realized pretty quickly that what I actually want to say to teenagers, and if I'm going to write for teenagers, and I'll get to that in a second, is I don't want to just do, John Green is already doing that stuff. There's Becky Albertalli is doing that stuff already, and I'm never going to do it as well as they are. But I can do this, and I can do this better than a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people. And so that's when I found my voice. When I realized that that book was going nowhere, I had the idea for no parking at the end times because there had just been this huge thing all over the country where this guy had put up billboards everywhere that said, give me your money, basically, because the world is ending. And there was an article in the New York Times, and I read it and I was like, oh shit. I was like, if you do that as an adult, you can immediately be like, oh, this guy's a nut. I'm gonna go back and rebuild my life. But if your parents do that, you have no control in that situation. And that's kind of when I was like, oh, I'm gonna write this book from the point of view of a teenager who is realizing not only that all this is happening, but more importantly, that her parents are not perfect, right? That her parents are infallible. And that's something that every single teenager goes through. And it might not, hopefully not on that grand of a scale. And so when I did that, I actually wrote this as an adult novel first. And then my agent read it and he's like, this could totally sell as an adult novel. I can get you 3 times as much money if we sell it as a YA novel. I was like, looks like I'm a YA novelist. But all joking aside, I already read YA and I really liked it. And I had a lot of friends who were writing YA. But I just wasn't sure if I was gonna be able to do this kind of stuff in YA. And turns out you can, and they're doing it a lot better than a lot of people. And so as far as being a youth pastor, you know, one of the lines I draw is I never use anything that a teenager's actually said to me, but I would use every single moment where I've been around a teenager and kind of, you know, use that empathy that you need when a moron kid is doing something moronic in the middle of the sanctuary, like all the empathy needed to be like, you know, put those into the book and not like, and so that's where that stuff comes from. So yeah. And now the kind of joke was like, Will Fly Away was actually going to be my call-in card to the adult world to be like, look, I can write something serious. And then it got nominated for the National Book Award. I was like, well, shit, looks like I'm staying in young adult world for a little while at least. And that's one of the things that's really great about Young Adult is that it's wide enough to be able to kind of take stuff like Love, Simon, which is a great book for a lot of teenagers, and then this book, which is totally different and would never have the same reader, but wide enough that it kind of acknowledges that there are enough kids out there that need different kind of books for kind of what you were mentioning before to have that accompaniment. So
We have time for one more question, maybe. I didn't notice the chat.
and she's probably going to hate me for doing this, but we have another celebrated young adult novelist on the call, Kirsten Cron Mills. So Kirsten, if I say anything, you can just hit me up on Facebook and tell me that you can out me if I said anything wrong.
You said nothing wrong. You said everything exactly right. You just kind of renewed my love for this particular medium. And I really want to thank Laura for that concept of accompanying.
Yeah.
That is really, really beautiful. I'm going to think about that, and I'm actually going in an hour to see my creative writing students, and we are just getting started with fiction this week. So I have new things to tell them. So thank you, Bryan. As always, I'm always appreciative of what you have to say.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming, and check out
Absolutely.
Kristen's books too, they're awesome, so mutual love society here.
Kristen, I'm glad that you were able to come. Anybody else out there in Zoom land? There's another novelist here too, Marin.
Oh.
Hey, Marin. I'm not putting you on the spot, just saying hey.
I just didn't look at any names, just not gonna,
Yeah.
that way I don't be intimidated.
I guess another question I would have is you've made some comments about thinking about moving into adult stuff. So then is that like, how do you kind of balance that? Yeah, I guess, how are you thinking about that, like for your future projects?
Yeah, I mean, I joke about it. I am writing, I'm almost done with an adult novel now, whether it gets published or not, I don't know. There's just certain things that I think, like, there's a certain amount of existentialism that I don't think is appropriate for teenagers necessarily, because they're just gonna get bored by it, and, but like, in true me fashion, the book that I'm writing is about, you know, a bunch of like friends from high school who go back to their high school because during homecoming because of the death of a friend. They all played on the same football team, so it's really not that far away from young adult. It's like Friday Night Lights meets Lost in Translation is kind of the pitch. But yeah, I mean, for me, I don't ever want to be, same for not wanting to be a Christian writer. Like I would never claim that. Or even a religious writer. I want the diversity to be able to, wherever I think a story can go. And because another book that I'm working on is for younger kids, it's for middle grade, it's all about growing up and,
Yeah.
you know, and how we kind of force kids to grow up when they hit 6th grade, which is ludicrous. They suddenly can no longer play with stuffed animals or play make-believe, and this is something my son went
Go
through.
trick-or-treating.
Go trick-or-treating, yeah. We actually put up we put up signups as teenagers welcome on our lawn for that reason. But it's like, yeah, so for me, it's like that story is not a YA story. It could be, it has a YA character in it, but it's more poignant if it's told from the point of view of the 6th grade sister. And the same thing with like, I don't want to tell a story about suicide for teenagers. I just don't, that's not interested. But like for adults, I think that there's some, especially for adult men, need kind of stories about intimacy that aren't, you know, and that's what that came from. And we'll fly away. I get killed all the time by idiots who email me and be like, Toby and Luke are gay, aren't they? It's like, what? How did you get that out of this book? And then I realize it's because of the intimacy, because they love one another. And so that's kind of, for me, is like with the adult novel, it's like there's a chance to kind of explore that for some of these kind of people who might see a book about football and, you know, and a Marine and stuff like that, but then get tricked into intimacy and feeling things. And so that's kind of the reason for it. But I'll never probably give up on YA just because I enjoy writing about teenagers, and I kind of enjoy writing, you know, those stories of adolescence a whole lot. So.
And you have a platform and a brand.
Smallest platform and brand possible. A little stamp. Barely get your toe on it.
Well, the other thing about YA in particular is if you're writing about teenagers, you're writing about transformation.
Yeah.
Inherently.
Yeah.
Because I love reading YA because of that, because there's so much change that is possible in that age group.
Any final questions or comments? Otherwise, transformation is a nice place to end.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Oh, thank you
Yeah,
for having me.
thank you,
Brian, so much.
And no pressure. If you want a book, you can have one, but no pressure because
A book, you're giving books.
I have 3 books.
Only if you find it.
I
There
will
you
sign
go.
it if you want to. Unless you want to resell it, then I won't. So it's the cover price. You'll be able to get at least $3 out of it. So.